So hi, I'm Lucy. I'm the Planning and Inclusivity Lead at CDS, a communications agency in Leeds. Inclusion is a hot topic at the moment and one that's central to everything we do as an agency. And we've been kind of thinking about this and working on this topic for a while now. So in 2018, we set off on a journey to really start to get under the skin of inclusion and define the role that communications plays in a successful strategy. And then in June last year, 2019, we commissioned a piece of research through YouGov to examine how people feel about the communications they receive. And we wanted to understand how some of the most vulnerable people in society feel about living in an increasingly digital world. But before I get into what the research told us, I just want to touch on what we mean by inclusivity and accessibility and why we place so much emphasis on it as an agency. So this is how the United Nations describes inclusivity. It's the practice and policy of including people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalised. Every decision we take has the potential to include or exclude users, and that's a lot of responsibility. So everything we do has to start with understanding. For us, that inclusive design is a process. It's a way of including and learning from people with a range of needs and understanding how they interact with and want to interact with the world. We then use these insights to strategize, design, plan, and ultimately make communications work better. So most academics agree that social class, ethnicity, educational status, disability and age are the main ways that people are marginalised in society. And whilst this is by no means exhaustive, and this graphic is by no means covers off every single eventuality, we believe that these are some of the more common communication problems that are experienced by those who are marginalised. Experiences are very different for individuals, but problems can often be layered, so one person ends up being further excluded in many different ways. This then amplifies the experience of being marginalised, which in turn leads to more problems. So in a very basic way, we can already start to see what typical communications barriers may be and who and where they are most likely to impact. We can also start to understand how these problems may be exacerbated by poor communication. But what I thought I'd do is just show you what this looks like in real life. So, as an example of some of the language barriers that may be faced, Vinod Gadiali, the president of a Hindu community group, recently pointed out that there's been an issue getting the key messages around COVID into certain communities due to language barriers. And when we think that actually Gujarati is spoken by 11.5% of the city, that's around 50,000 people. So we can start to understand that a key step has been missed here in the design and execution of that key messaging. We've had people like Jane Caldwell at Age UK pointing out that the way processes and structures are set up within local government, for example, are effectively excluding those who may need help the most by moving to a digital-only service. And this is a problem we see a lot. Organisations are trying to modernise, to speed up processes and cut costs by moving things online, which is fantastic and great for a lot of people. But we need to be sure that our good intentions don't accidentally hurt or negatively affect those who are already marginalised. And again, when we understand that 4.2 million people over 65 have never used the internet, it kind of begs the question, why the hell are we not giving people more options? This is a great example of the mismatch between an audience's needs and an organisation's objectives. They want to move everything online, but that's not where all of their audience is. The reasons people aren't online are also vital to understand. These are often complex. While the COVID outbreak has made digital a priority for a lot of organisations, not everyone wants, can afford, or has access to the internet. According to Ofcom, the two groups least likely to be online are the elderly and those in DE socio-economic groups. These are the poorest in society, and in this example, those who are most likely to be in need of a food bank. If we've already got tens of millions of people relying on pay-as-you-go service, what impact do we think that the current and impending job crisis is going to have on their financial capabilities? Digging a little deeper into the reasons why people are online can reveal so much more about the people behind those statistics and help you to understand how you need to change your communication strategy to suit your audience. This is a quote from a documentary film called H is for Harry, and it's a fantastic coming-of-age story about Harry, who's an 11-year-old boy. He arrives at secondary school in suburban London, and he's unable to read or write. It's a really heartbreaking bit of the film when his dad basically turns around and starts talking about the perpetual cycle of being trapped in poverty and illiteracy. Education is often the route out of poverty, but many children miss out on school due to their poverty. Maybe that's because their families need them to earn money, or maybe no one's around to make sure they attend, but by sacrificing their education, young people can become trapped in that cycle of poverty. If we know that the average reading age in Britain is 9, why aren't we prioritising plain English in our communications? The words we use to communicate have a huge impact on our audience's understanding. These are the differences that good copywriting can make. Disability benefits are supposed to support people. Instead, we find examples of the focus being on the physical, rather than actually looking at where that person needs help and support. And this really highlights the problem with tick box exercises and processes. No two people are the same or have the same experience, so how can we expect to fill in a form and get the best outcome for someone? If we think about the volume of people that are affected by hidden disabilities or impairments, it really hammers home how far we have to go in truly understanding the people that we're trying to reach. This is why empathy, the need to truly understand your audience, is massively important. And this isn't a problem that's going to go away. In fact, this is going to continue to become more important as our population continues to age and grow. However, although I've talked about the fact that not everyone is online, inevitably, internet usage is on the rise every year. ONS data from 2019 shows that 78% of disabled adults and 83% of adults aged 65 to 74 are now internet users. During the COVID pandemic and lockdown, we've all had to do more online as we've been restricted in ways we've never before experienced. And this has given us all a glimpse of how it feels to be restricted in our day-to-day movements and options. Try and cling on to that empathy. As more and more people come online, we need to create a landscape and an experience that works for all users, regardless of their digital skills or needs. If more of the population is using the internet, it's more important than ever that websites and online services are accessible. Unfortunately, we know that's not the case. This audit from WebAIM that was done last year was pretty shocking statistic. And it just highlights the fact that for many organisations, website accessibility is too often an afterthought. Imagine your experience over the last few months if you were only able to access fewer than 3% of websites. How frustrating must it feel to find the website you need, navigate to it, and then find that you can't actually do anything once you get there? Research has shown that those who do struggle online would perhaps spend more if websites were actually accessible and allowed them to browse in the ways that they need. Delivering the best possible accessible experience for all users should be seen as an essential investment for the future. But this isn't just about financial. Organisations have a legal requirement to ensure the services can be accessed by all users. Having a website that fails accessibility is against the law, and we've seen more and more cases in the last few years of charities such as the RNIB pursuing legal action against organisations with inaccessible websites. However, inclusivity and accessibility isn't just about your website. Okay? When I'm talking about communications, I'm talking about every single touch point that you produce. It's also really important, I think, to point out that when I'm talking about making things accessible and being inclusive, I'm not just talking about specific users who may have additional needs or additional requirements that are kind of outside the scope of what we may think of as normal. What I'm actually talking about here is treating each and every person in your audience as an individual, each with their own needs, their own priorities, and their own challenges. In the research we did, the message was loud and clear that people want to be in control of how organisations communicate with them. In fact, 77% of the people we surveyed thought it was really important that they can choose how a company communicates with them. People want to be in control and feel that they should be listened to about their needs and preferences. This quote in particular from my research really, really shocked me. Telling a customer who specifically asked you for a larger print to just get someone else to read it for you is absolutely an inappropriate response. A lot of these problems actually come down to having the systems and processes in place to even capture and store those user preferences and information. And it's absolutely crucial that you have those in place. In our research, we found several examples of customers' needs and specific requests being ignored. That just leads to a negative and potentially damaging user experience. Our research also showed that in general, the quality and accessibility of communications just isn't up to scratch. People felt like organisations have a duty to ensure that the communications they produce and how they communicate is fit for purpose. Many people we spoke to unfortunately felt this wasn't the case. In fact, we discovered that 67% of people we spoke to had experienced a problem with a piece of communication they'd received, which meant they didn't understand the message that they were being told. And this recently happened to me. I received a letter from Public Health England about a COVID antibody test I'd had, and I just didn't understand what it was saying. It kept going on about arrays and had used a lot of technical medical jargon that I just wasn't familiar with. About an hour later, I got a text message from my GP on my phone, and it just basically said, look, your blood tests come back, you've got some antibodies, but you don't have enough antibodies to be immune, so just make sure you've been really, really careful. It's really, really simple, really, really clear, and I just thought, why couldn't the letter just have said that? It would have saved a lot of time. Most of the issues that were kind of raised in our research are simply down to organisations not actually being user-centric and actually thinking about who their users are and how they might consume the information. That process of user testing and subsequent optimisation of your communications is also, unfortunately, more often than not, completely ignored. I'm sure that everyone on this call has an experience where they've read something or received something from an organisation and just thought, what the hell are they talking about? Important information needs to be shared clearly. It needs to be transparent and it needs to be understood by the target audience. And if it isn't being understood, we need to understand why. In our research, we found that most of the problems that people reported are actually pretty straightforward to solve. For example, I've already touched on jargon. The abundance of jargon is a pain that we all experience and see on a day-to-day basis, but this really shouldn't be a difficult problem to fix. It just means explaining things in simple, clear terms and ensuring that it can be understood by a non-subject matter expert. And that's often the problem with having those subject matter experts creating and producing content. We need to make sure that's actually been tested and checked before it's pushed out into the public domain, because you have this problem of assumed knowledge on the part of the writer of what their audience is going to understand. And I'd actually argue that every single issue that's listed here could actually be avoided by just testing and thinking about users before sending. And this really is where inclusive communication starts. So the aim needs to be that every customer-facing output is available and accessible to every user in the format they need and on the platform they want. And that means producing communications that are accessible and available to all customers, all stakeholders, all users, regardless of circumstances, ability, language, age, or location. Adopting an inclusive approach means looking again at everything you do from the perspective of your customers, your employees, and your stakeholders, and asking, is this actually fit for the people that we're trying to reach? Too many communication strategies are formulated and approved without any thought being given to the audience that strategy is seeking to engage. By remaining outward-facing, organisations run the risk of alienating their customers by pushing ahead with a strategy that is out of date, out of touch, and not aligned to their intended audience. When I talk about an inclusive communication strategy, I mean placing real importance on the needs of your customers, users, and stakeholders. In a typical strategy, as you can see over on the left here, the organisational objectives are the most important driving force. So what is the business trying to achieve? We then start to move on to the communications objectives. What do we need to say to achieve those business objectives? And only then is the audience even considered. And unfortunately, in many cases, this step is just completely skipped completely. People just jump straight into that tactical planning phase. With an inclusive strategy, those audience needs are actually moved right to the top of the funnel. So when we're considering what the business is trying to achieve, we're also examining who our audience are and what they need and want. How can we align the two? Where are those priorities mismatched? Are there any that are wildly out of place? Only by understanding how these two priorities overlap and clash can we begin to devise a strategy that will help us achieve our business goals without alienating or frustrating our audience. We can also start to plan how to better meet the needs of our audience. Think back to that earlier example of the council moving their services online, but the people that need to access that service aren't using the internet. This type of thing happens all the time and could be avoided by considering the needs of the audience alongside your organisation's objectives. Your strategy is invaluable. It communicates your vision to others. Setting out what you're trying to achieve and why is vital to get that buy-in. Your strategy becomes your blueprint for every piece of communications that your team put out. And when you move into that tactical planning phase, it will help to keep you focused and on track. And the benefits of an inclusive strategy and approach is pretty straightforward, really. That better audience understanding leads to a better strategy, which in turn leads to better planning, resulting in less wastage, increased satisfaction, and better engagement. So, how can you actually start to prioritise inclusivity and begin to build those inclusive practices into your work? Well, the first step is to audit what you've already got. This means looking across your outputs, your brand, your website, emails, adverts, print communications, anything, everything. Once you understand what needs to be fixed, you can then make a plan to start working through those issues. Digging into audience data can be daunting, but will always deliver surprising and enlightening insights. Segmenting is quite an interesting term here, as I'm talking about segmenting a little bit differently as how we might do with typical marketing personas. These are usually based on demographics or lifestyle or purchase history. Instead, we can start to segment in a narrower but far deeper way that looks at users from a needs perspective. This will enrich your customer data and allow you to start building a much more detailed and useful picture of the people that you're trying to communicate with. Performing user research is a must. This doesn't have to be expensive or extensive, but it has to be a priority. Actually speaking to and hearing feedback from your audience will deliver really useful insights and ideas that will vastly improve the quality and satisfaction of what you produce. User testing with a robust, representative sample of your users is also key to understanding what works, what doesn't, and where you can improve. Building testing into your design process will ultimately save time and money because you'll be producing better content that's actually fit for purpose. Testing the effectiveness of your communications is also really important, and this can be done through a combination of quantitative methods such as ROI, such as analytics or reporting, as well as gathering that more qualitative user feedback. Knowing which channels to send the information through and to which users will improve your ROI. And finally, I'd recommend that you create a plan for that ongoing research. It may be something that you can only actually afford to do sporadically, but building in the time and the budget for that research will pay dividends. And finally, I just want everyone here today to start thinking about why you and your organisation maybe aren't prioritising inclusivity. It's important to understand the obstacles that you're likely to face when trying to adopt a user-centric approach. Thinking about your own experiences within your organisation, what are those biggest barriers to you and your organisation truly embracing and adopting inclusivity? Once you understand your own internal blockers, it's much easier to start building a business case to move inclusivity and accessibility up the agenda. All of the things listed here are pretty valid reasons that might make inclusion not a priority for you, but I'd argue that it's getting more and more difficult, if not impossible, to simply look the other way and focus on other things. The events of this year have shown us how vital it is to have empathy and shown us that we all need to look out for each other. Organisations have a responsibility to the people that they serve. By adopting an inclusive approach, organisations have the opportunity to make a real impact on people's lives, and the time to act is now. Those who do will reap the benefits of prioritising people. Those who don't will be left behind.